stepping you into this world of depravity that I'm going to take you
Yes,
into.
it is very.
So actually, to piggyback on what Eleanor was talking about, we were talking about what my tail end of this was going to be, and it's basically the Victorian Era will kill you. Whatever these people do to themselves, if they survive, it's a miracle. They're, it's amazing. So here's another, as Eleanor said, this new interest in photography and conveying these theatrical ideas that they had, and they're also starting to get the idea of moving pictures in the later Victorian age. So we've got this skeleton, this omen of death, sort of looming over this Gibson girl, and she's obviously a little upset by that. So we kind of go, I'm sort of carrying you again through funerals. So this is a stage photo from the morning. As Eleanor mentioned, you had people being buried in cages so their bodies wouldn't be stolen by universities. But the whole tradition of mourning, like how we really mourn people today, was started by Victorians. We had these shrouds over the mirrors so that the person's spirit wouldn't get sucked in through the mirror. You stopped the clock in the room to memorialize the time the person died. You hang the laurel wreath on the door with black crepe ribbon so people know that someone has died, and if you're not there for the funeral, you should not come in. They also would set all of the photos down so that the dead person's spirit would not pick someone to take with them. When the body leaves the house, it left feet first so that it wouldn't be able to see the door it just exited from, or else it might try to go back inside. There's Eleanor had mentioned staying with the body until the funeral. We were not embalming bodies yet, so we hadn't developed that science. Of course, historically we have. I mean, the Egyptians got to do like the fish and then filled you with sand and put you in a sock and buried you, but we weren't doing that yet. So you were sitting with the body while it decomposed, which was creepy, but it was tradition, so yay. And we also sat with the body in case it wasn't dead. The person may have slipped into a coma, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to bury them alive. So it's this idea of the wake, staying awake. And wakes traditionally last about 3 days within religious households. A device that coffin makers created was a gravestone bell. You tied a string around the corpse's finger and put a bell on the headstone. And if the person was somehow still alive, the bell would ring because the person would say, hey. Once you were officially dead, it would not be uncommon for you to be buried face down. Here's why. This was the age of Mary Shelley, the living dead, vampires. So they were afraid that there was a possibility you could be the undead. Even though you're Aunt Judith, you could be a vampire. So they would bury you face down, so if you tried to claw your way out, you would just dig yourself further and further in. Here's the grave cage, which did stop people from digging you up. But also, what if you're a vampire and they accidentally buried you face up? Unless you're a vampire that can turn into a bat or fog, which defeats the purpose of this, but it's a love the cage nonetheless. We're still going to okay, just want to sleep here. So it's, there was also a huge amount of, everyone was dying left and right in the Victorian age, but there's reasons for that. Before I get onto that, this was also the dawn of the funeral parlor. We didn't have funeral parlors. We just had people that died, you built a box, you dug a hole, you called it a day. But in the Victorian age, they had funeral parlors. It was the whole pomp and circumstance, ostrich feathers and horses on a hearse, and they would actually have mourners for hire. If you wanted to look really popular, you could hire people to walk alongside the coffin and look sad. They wouldn't talk, they wouldn't sing, they wouldn't cry, they just looked real depressed. So this, again, fascination with death, as Eleanor had mentioned. Where was that going? Oh, my train gets derailed so easily.
Vampires.
Vampires were another thing.
All right.
So funeral, mourning, all of that. This obsession with death. Memorializing them with care. This is fun. I found this in my research. You don't have to read it all. But this is deadly superstitions. This was the best one. If a firefly gets in your house, you could die. If you smell roses when none are around, someone will die. If you see yourself in a dream, your death will follow. If you see an owl in the daytime, there will be a death. If you dream about birth, someone will die. If it rains in the open grave, someone will die. If a bird crashes into your window, there has been a death, besides the bird. If a sparrow lands on a piano, a sparrow, someone in the home will die. If a picture falls off the wall, someone will die. 2 deaths in the family means a third will follow. The hoot of an owl foretells a death. A single snowdrop going in the garden foretells a death. Having only red and white flowers together in a vase means death will soon follow. So you've got to figure somebody's like, I'm going to send her red and white flowers. Dropping an umbrella or opening one in the house means there will be a murder in the home. So this is what I mean. The Victorian age will kill you. It doesn't matter what. If you wear red shoes on a Tuesday, there will be a death. So, deadly superstitions. When someone dies, you might want to send them flowers. So we have the Victorian invention of the language of flowers. These are the best ones. There's the ones that are like love, unrequited love, love from afar, love, love, love. Apple blossoms preference, basil, hatred. Cactus, endurance. Cyclamen, goodbye. Geranium, stupidity. And what's nice is if you send a stupid person a geranium, they won't know, they'll think you're being nice. Orange lily, hatred. Purple hyacinth, sorrow. Marigold, cruelty. Mint, virtue. Nasturtiums, patriotism. Parsley, festivity. Rosemary, resemblance. Tulips, I declare war against you. Violet, faithfulness. And zinnia's thoughts of absent friends. The Victorian age was also known for symbolist paintings, in which the painting would contain a moralistic attribute, like a little dog standing at the door meant that faithful companions were waiting for you at home. A little girl who had broken a vase was telling you the story about how you must be honest. So flowers would find their way into Victorian paintings, paintings like Whistler and things like that. And those flowers would also help to tell the story. But the Victorians had a meaning for every flower. Every rose, every color. Every lily, every color. It's remarkable. Going along with flowers, we have this idea of, the Victorian etiquette thing is remarkable. The idea of the calling cards is lovely. It's something we still do today. That's where we get business cards from. But with calling cards, there's the basic etiquette of a folded top left corner, meaning a visit was made in person rather than being sent by a servant. A folded bottom left corner meant that you were leaving for an extended trip. A folded top right corner meant congratulations, and a folded bottom right corner meant condolence. The calling cards would be made by women and men within the communities. This was something that rich white people did. This was not something that someone working in a sweatshop was doing. This was something that leisure people, the leisurely class was doing. So there were set hours that you would visit someone's house to make a social call. Social calls only lasted between 15 and 30 minutes, no longer and no less. You would come to someone's door, hand their servant a card. The servant would take the card, leave you in the hallway. If the woman felt like seeing you, she'd say, yes, show them in. If she didn't, she'd say, no, I'm not home. And the servant would come back outside, say, I'm sorry, she's not home, when you knew that she's home. But you just leave. And if the woman wanted to see you, then she'd come to you and leave you a card, and you'd keep playing phone tag back and forth until a month later you finally got together for like a cracker. But that's sort of the idea of this prolonged exposure and formality that we have in the Victorian age. Calling cards are just a phenomenon to me. You would even have calling cards for children, so they could give them to other children. Men would have them, but they'd be very simple calling cards. You'd never have your address on it, because if you're in the same neighborhood, you know who's there. If you just moved to a neighborhood, it was bad etiquette for you to go out and do it first. You had to wait for the neighbors to come to you, and then you could go out and do it to them. What else? If you were in mourning, you would get special calling cards that were rimmed in black. You were expected to mourn for a year. After 6 months was over, you could stop wearing black and start wearing purple. As you progressed through your morning cycle, the black band around your card would get skinnier and skinnier and skinnier until it went away, meaning that your year was up and you were back on the market. For those that have seen Gone with the Wind, that moment in the movie where Scarlett is not mourning for her husband that she's only been married to for a month because she didn't even want to marry him to begin with, goes to the party and dances with Rhett, and everyone's horrified because she's wearing black. And she's at a party. You were not allowed to go to any social functions for a year unless you were predisposed to depression, in which case you could go out and socialize with people, but certainly not to a dance, certainly not to a wedding or anything like that. Now, ladies. This is obviously a cartoon, but it's not that far off the mark. The corset, and actually body control in general, has been a thorn in everyone's side since the dawn of time. We had corsets and waist cinchers since the Renaissance, and they kind of come to a crescendo in the Victorian period, because we start to get away from just creating a slim silhouette into complete body disfiguration. So, corsets were marketed like the Dickens. As this ad indicates, not only were mothers wearing them, but their daughters were wearing them too, and if your daughter wasn't wearing them, then you were not a responsible mother. Corsets did find their place also in the medical field. They were used a lot for spinal alignment and for people that were recovering from accidents. So they did have quite a useful purpose that way, but as far as the Victorian age, it grew to sort of this frenzy of insane proportions. The corset was originally designed, at least the corset that's featured here, which is sort of a full-body Joan of Arc traction harness that she's wearing. The corset was designed to support the breasts because we did not have a bra yet. There was no such thing as underwear. The bra of the time was 2 handkerchiefs and a couple of shoelaces. That was the bra. Not like she was going out jogging, but there was no bra. So the top half of the corset would support the bust, the bottom half would trim the waist and the hips, and it would also bear the weight of 14 pounds of clothing that you would put on. When you got dressed in the morning, your chemise went on top, your bloomers were pulled up. Well, actually, when you got dressed, first stockings, then bloomers, tied at the waist. Bloomers were open on the front and the back because once you got in your gear, you weren't taking any of it off. Put on your chemise, then put on your corset, then crinolines and petticoats, and finally your garments. And by the time you were ready, you couldn't get to your shoes, so that's why you had a lady's maid helping you get those on. We're going to talk about quackery in a minute, but they even had electric corsets, which were designed to help you with bone issues. And it says electric, and I was expecting to find something that plugged into a light socket, but this is akin to those copper bracelets that you wear that are supposed to help you play golf better or something like that. So instead of having whalebone, the front and back hook and eye closure and the back boning that held the laces were magnetized steel. So the doctor, wink wink, that came up with this said that the magnetic pull between the two sides would help to relieve bodily ailments. I mean, this thing would relieve constipation, hangnails, hammer toes. It would just solve all your problems if you bought this undergarment. But of course it didn't. All it did was screw up your bones. They also had maternity corsets because no one likes a fatty, even if you're full of babies. So the maternity corset would actually push the baby down so that you could have a slim waist. And husbands hated this because they didn't want little pinhead babies. They wanted healthy babies. But the women were so brainwashed into what an aesthetic was that they were willing to sacrifice their health and their child's health to maintain a wasp waist. The aesthetic by the time we get to the late Victorian period is that of a pigeon. You want to have this huge pigeon chest, and then the corset would sort of bend your spine, sort of stick your butt out, and then you'd have the cage behind you. They also say that women were supposed to look like a ship coming into harbor with like the bow here, and then the train was like the spray of the propeller water that came behind it. But it really did sort of mess up your physiology. The maternity corsets as well. And there are maternity girdles that people have to like support the weight. I mean, if you're like a tiny little woman and your husband's like a mastiff and you're gonna have this gigantic baby, you need help. But that doesn't squish your kid, that just sort of lifts and separates. So this, however, would push the kid down, your kid could be deformed, in which case they would squish their head back into shape. But if the woman had multiple children, at this time we had sort of a 50-50 shot of a living child and one that was born prematurely or still. If she had a lot of action down there, with this corset on, you could have uterus prolapse, which was also not something that you wanted to have. I don't even know how that would work, but it happened. And how do you undo it? But that's not a risk. Potatoes?
Yes. I'll explain to you later.
Okay, tell me that. Now, if you were a young woman going to the tropics looking for a man, you would wear a ventilated corset, which was whalebone with the middle section removed, or rather the textile removed, so that in the tropics you could breathe a little more freely and you could feel the wind running through 2 inches of your body. It would still be laced just as tight. As you can see, it's just as rigid and just as constricting, but they felt that this would be more comfortable for women to wear. Because at this time, it was that age of the sun never setting on England. We had colonies across the world, and so you could find an Anglo woman in India with her husband who happened to be in the military, and she would want to be a little more comfortable. She wouldn't get it, but she wanted it. And men had them too, because nobody likes a fatty. The aesthetic for men was the same pigeon-chested look. Tiny little waist, conical torso. So up at the top, we've got a little waist cincher, we've got a, economy range, and then we've got the full metal jacket right here. This guy's is particularly amusing because it goes down into the legs and it lets his little bloomers hang out. As you can see, full tummy control right there, reinforced girdle. And it creates that little wasp waist. And he's standing there so proud and tall, like, look at me. So this is what it would do to you. After, obviously, these people have been dead for a while to begin with, but here's a normal rib cage. Notice the broad V. Decades of wearing corsets bend the bones. Bones are flexible. That's why we're able to get up after we fall down. But the corsets would constrict you so much that it would completely reroute not only your bones, but your organs. If you weren't knocked up, what would happen in a corset is that your liver would get pushed up into your rib cage and your stomach would get pushed down. If your stomach is pushed down, this pushes down your intestines and can lead to intestinal difficulty. So you can see the difference just in this, not to mention what it does to your spine and your hip alignment. And here's a liver that I believe is in the Mutter Museum, but these are indentions from the rib cage because the liver has been pressed into the cage. So, with all of that madness that was going on, tiny waists, big boobs for everybody, the Victorian age is wonderful because it's got all of these subcultures going on, dirty and clean. And one of them that was going on was the aesthetic movement, which William Morris was associated with, Dante Gabriel Rossetti the painter was associated with. And the aesthetic movement believed in art for art's sake. Oscar Wilde was a huge proponent of it. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a huge part of that aesthetic movement as well. And within that aesthetic movement came another movement that was called the Rational Dress Act. And it was sort of led by social critics like John Ruskin, William Morris wrote about it. artists and poets and sculptors and designers were all saying that what people are doing themselves is insane. We need to dress for the human form, not make the human form fit a dress. So these two garments reflect the rational dress reform, in which the garments are A-line, they float away from the body, all of the constricting undergarments are gone, you're just wearing undergarments for modesty, not for contortion. There was also at this time a big revival in Greek design. We have a neo-Greek sort of design bubble in there, so here's a toga, a Victorian toga. And then over here something that looks more like maybe a nightgown, but it's actually an evening dress. So this Rational Dress Act wanted a rejection of all this contortion. They wanted people to be comfortable. And as we saw in the first slide, little girls were wearing corsets. They certainly didn't want children wearing these constricting garments because children are still growing, they need to play. And the children, while the women and men sort of a little more loose and casual, the children actually looked like Little Miss Muffet. The little girls and little boys all looked like they came out of a Pride and Prejudice novel. I mean, it was very loose and flowy and really quite charming, and not rigid and restrictive. This is a painting that came out at the time to actually satirize the aesthetic movement and this Rational Dress Act. This was the showing at the great gallery. Let me see who did that. I believe it's Frith. Probably at the Royal Academy, William Powell Frith from 1881. And this is a huge painting. And it features a lot of prominent artists and designers and architects and writers of the time, but in the foreground we have two groups of aesthetics. At the center of this is Oscar Wilde, who was this self-proclaimed expert, which basically is what everybody who has a gig today is. They're always a self-proclaimed expert. And he's lecturing to these enamored people. We've got aesthetic women here in their rational dress, throwing away the idea of the corset, the tightly cinched waist. I mean, look at how erect those women are sitting. There's no slouching in this garment. These women are quite comfortable. You can see the little girl there in the little bonnet. It's very realistic. It's not this unachievable ideal. And, like I said, we didn't have a bra, but if you were still lacking, you could get woven celluloid boobs. Stick them on there, tuck them down your corset, and then you cover them with a little cotton chemise so that it doesn't look like you're wearing two wicker baskets on the top of your corset. They had rubber ones as well, but I think that's amusing. Now, quackery. So this is the snake oil salesman. During the Victorian age, we had a lot of discovery in science, in psychology, in physiology, but up to that period, people had not even really seen a doctor unless they were incredibly wealthy. People usually went to their pharmacist. And their pharmacist or chemist would say, oh, looks like you've got an infection, here, use this. Oh, you've got a headache, here, take one of these. And it was good, solid information. But during this time of discovery in science and industry, we had people sort of coming out of the woodwork saying that they could cure every single problem you have with this one little bottle. And of course, people are gullible, and they will buy it. So here's some advertisements. Anti-fat. So you won't be fat. Cocaine toothache drops. Instant relief. Because it's cocaine. Beard generator. In 6 weeks, you can have a beard. Berries, trichophorus for the hair. Not only will you get long, long hair, but you also get a more in the male to fan you. What's this? Pennyroyal pills for gonorrhea or bleat. Valentine's meat juice. It was believed that drinking meat juice was a cure-all, starting in the Regency period. It is meat juice. It's not like it was from Dr. Meat. It is meat juice. And allegedly, it cures diarrhea, dysentery, and cholera. I think this would give you diarrhea or dysentery. Cholera might go away, by proportion to the diarrhea you're going to get if you take all the meat juice. But anyway, so we had more and more doctors, we had more and more schools opening up, more and more learning about the human body and what makes you better and what doesn't. But for those people that got magazines, and you didn't want to go to the doctor because the doctor was still expensive, you could send away, if your diarrhea or dysentery could wait for you to get the meat juice, but you could send away for a cure-all, which didn't work. I'm just reading, because this one was funny, the great remedy for corpulence.
What is gleet?
I don't know what gleet is. I'm like, what's gleet? It sounds like a toothpaste. It doesn't even say what gleet is.
I wonder if it's maybe syphilis.
It could be.
Yeah.
It could be like a non-classy gonorrhea. So the other, another aspect of the Victorian age, and again we see Queen Victoria and her family, was this idea of, and Eleanor speaks about this as well, was the idea of the cult of domesticity, as it was called. And this means that the woman, the wife, is the mother, is the saint, is the savior, is the one that keeps the home fires burning. She's responsible for making sure all the children grow up morally responsible. She's the one that teaches them etiquette, and she's the one that helps them learn and grow and tie their shoes and take a bath and become adults. And she has no other job but to do that. So she has to run a house, she has to hire help if she can. But there's a huge amount of pressure put on women at this point. Within the cult of domesticity, and I'm showing you this picture of Victoria because she was the family woman. She was the emblem of this age. Her and Albert and their children were the perfect family. They were the atomic family of the period, if you will. And this cult of domesticity to men meant that my wife is an angel. I must only have sex with an angel to have a baby. And, the wife would say, well, you could do more. But, I must only have sex with you, otherwise I am defiling you. I am making you impure. So she was only getting action when there was a baby on the way. He was only getting action to make a baby. You know where this is going. He wants more action. So, with the rise of cult of domesticity, with this idea, and by the way, this is a modern concept, or a modern name, we also have a rise in prostitution. So here you can see a rather upset-looking wife throwing daggers at her husband for looking at this woman in the short skirt and the short shirt. Here's why prostitution grew. With the Industrial Revolution came the arrival and the mass production of the steam engine. The steam engine is a locomotive to transport goods across England and ultimately across the world. The steam engine needs a place to go, so it goes across the farmland. The farmland is bought and sold to the railroad industries. The farm families move into town. They take jobs in horrible factories. If you don't want a job in a horrible factory and you have no money, your limits are your alternatives are few. Young, pretty women between the ages of 18 and 22 have an alternative. They could be a hooker.